In the dawn of this new atomic age, the world is draped in an iron curtain. Peace, we are told, rests on a knife's edge, on the grim mathematics of deterrence. Our nation's shield is its long-range strategic air arm, but the distances to any potential foe are truly vast. Thousands of miles over unforgiving oceans and frozen wastes. Our largest bombers, the silver guardians of the sky, must fly far beyond the reach of their protective fighter escorts. They fly alone, vulnerable to the new breed of enemy jet interceptors. How then to get eyes on the target? How to deliver a strike and survive? The problem is range. The challenge is defense. From the minds of our top engineers comes a solution. An idea so bold, so audacious, it seems plucked from the pages of science fiction. What if the bomber no longer had to fly alone? What if the protector, the swift, sharp-eyed reconnaissance jet, could be carried with it? Not just escorted, but attached, taken into the heart of hostile territory, released like an eagle from its nest, and then retrieved. Recovered in midair, pulled back into the safety of its mother ship. A flying trapeze operating at 30,000 feet. A strategic Parasite. This is the story of that gamble. A top-secret endeavor to create a fighter conveyor, to combine the colossal endurance of our greatest bomber with the speed and agility of a jet. A project to give our long reach a set of claws.
Modern requirements for a combined long-range, high-speed reconnaissance system resulted in the initiation of Project MX-1602. The ultimate goal of this project is to provide a means of combining the high performance of an RF-84F with a long-range capability of an RB-36 for bomb damage assessment missions. Consolidated Vultee Aircraft Corporation, Fort Worth, Texas, in coordination with Weapons Systems Division, WADC, designed for use in the RB-36, a mechanism which would carry, release, and retrieve the Parasite airplane. With this arrangement, the Parasite could be transported to the enemy zone, where it would be released for the reconnaissance mission. After completing its mission, the Parasite would be retrieved by the B-36 and carried back to the home base. Designed to accomplish the Parasite operation, the first mechanism installed on the RB-36 consisted essentially of a main retracting jack and a boom-type structure. Located near the end of the boom is a drogue which will receive the probe attached to the Parasite aircraft. In the air, the Parasite is retrieved by extending the trapeze and lowering the boom so that the fighter can engage its nose probe with the drogue receiver. This arrangement allows the Parasite to remain as far from the carrier as possible during the critical period of initial hook-on. To prove the feasibility of the operation, an available F-84E aircraft was used. A probe installed on the nose of the Parasite is used to engage the drogue on the end of the boom. The probe is locked into place by the operation of two spring-loaded latches. The Parasite can be released by retracting these latches and allowing the drag load of the F-84 to withdraw it from the drogue. During flight tests with the long boom, initial contact was difficult because the drogue moved in a small eccentric circle. In addition, the drogue had a tendency to tumble unless the probe was engaged almost dead center. This was corrected by redesigning the drogue to make it self-centering. When attached to the single-point position, the Parasite aircraft proved to be divergently unstable in pitch. Due to this instability, the pilot was not able to maintain contact for longer than 30 seconds. As a result of these flight tests, it was decided that the vertical flexibility of the boom was causing the pitch instability. In an attempt to eliminate this instability, the boom was shortened to reduce its flexibility. This change necessitated the installation of an additional probe just forward of the Parasite canopy to accommodate the short boom. Flight tests with this configuration did not indicate any appreciable improvement in the instability problem. The drogue receiver was then temporarily installed between the aft latches on the boom in order to determine if a rigid installation would solve the problem. At this location, hydraulic pressure could be maintained on the trapeze to provide almost infinite vertical stiffness. With this configuration, the Parasite was stable during single-point contact. These flight tests demonstrated that pitch instability could be eliminated provided the vertical stiffness of the boom could be adequately increased. To accomplish this, a hydraulic snubber strut was installed between the end of the boom and the front of the B-36 Bombay. The snubber strut prevents sudden changes in the position of the boom, but does not hinder slow motions which occur during retraction or extension. This installation solved the pitch instability problem for smooth air operations. Parasite aircraft is secured to the trapeze mechanism by pins located just below and to the rear of the canopy. For a normal air launch operation, the pilot of the Parasite disengages his aft pins by operating one of the levers mounted on the instrument panel. This actuates a kicker on each side of the fuselage, which in turn trips the latch release on the boom. To disengage from the single-point position, he uses another lever to retract the latches on the nose probe. In case the manual release does not function, the pilot can release from the single-point position by firing an explosive squib, which severs the nose probe. Either the B-36 pilot or the trapeze operator can jettison the Parasite at any time. The two aircraft can take off separately and make an aerial hookup, or the Parasite can be loaded into the B-36 on the ground. The main gear of the carrier aircraft are placed on blocks in order to provide clearance for the vertical tail of the F-84. Loaded on a dolly, the Parasite can be rolled into position under the trapeze and the nose probe engaged. Then, the trapeze will be lowered until the aft latches engage the pins on the F-84. At this time, the aircraft is ready for retraction into the bomb bay of the B-36. Takeoffs and landings with a Parasite in stowed position were considered to be normal by the B-36 pilot. The Parasite must be placed in the extended position prior to the raising or lowering of the main gear of the carrier aircraft. This is necessary to prevent damage to the wings of the F-84. After the gear has been retracted, the Parasite is raised into stowed position, which is the normal cruise configuration. When the B-36 is airborne, the trapeze mechanism is controlled by an operator who observes the entire procedure through a special window located in the pressure bulkhead, between the camera compartment and the forward bomb bay. A switch at the top left of the panel is actuated for extension or retraction of the trapeze. The center switch applies hydraulic pressure to maintain the trapeze in the extended position. The switch at the bottom is used for raising or lowering the boom for retrieving or launching of the F-84. As the trapeze operator makes preparations for launching, the pilot, assisted by a crew member, leaves the camera compartment and enters the Parasite aircraft. The F-84 pilot advises the trapeze operator by radio when he is ready for the trapeze to be extended. At this point, the operator actuates the extension switch, which also unlatches the trapeze from the stowed position. During the flight tests, radio contact was maintained at all times between the F-84E, the trapeze operator, and the B-36 pilot. After he reaches the extended position, the fighter pilot accomplishes an air start and checks his instruments and controls. When he is satisfied that the aircraft is operating normally, he requests that the launching operation be initiated. Release of the aft latches is then accomplished either by the pilot of the Parasite or by the trapeze operator. As soon as the latches are open, the boom down switch is actuated and the aircraft is lowered to the launching position. Release from the single point attachment is accomplished by the pilot of the Parasite at his discretion. To perform the retrieving operation, the F-84 pilot lines the probe up with the drogue on the boom. He then increases speed to accomplish the single point attachment. After the initial hook-on has been made, the trapeze operator actuates the boom-up switch, which raises the Parasite to a point where the aft latches are engaged. To maintain alignment of the F-84E between the aft latches of the boom, the trapeze operator directs the pilot of the Parasite to move right or left. Mechanical indicators visible to the trapeze operator and green lights visible to the pilot of the Parasite indicate when the aft latches are locked. Several release and retrieve operations were completed to evaluate this critical phase of the Parasite program. When the Parasite is attached at the single point, it has a Dutch roll tendency which can be readily controlled by the pilot. A rate-type damper installed in the yaw and roll axes of the control system aids in reducing the Dutch roll tendency. Tests proved that this damper system was not necessary for the F-84E aircraft. The majority of the retrieving operations have been made using only the manual control. Release and retrieve operations were successfully accomplished at indicated air speeds ranging from 180 to 230 miles per hour. The pilot of the F-84E during these flight tests was Major C.E. Anderson of the WADC Flight Test Division. Prior to the retraction from the extended position, the engine of the F-84E is shut down. Actuation of the trapeze up switch then hydraulically retracts the main lifting jack to raise the Parasite to the stowed position. In this position, the pilot of the F-84 opens the canopy and steps out onto a catwalk in the bomb bay of the B-36. After closing the canopy, the pilot proceeds along the catwalk and enters the camera compartment of the carrier aircraft. In order to extend the gear of the carrier aircraft prior to landing, the Parasite must be lowered to the extended position. If the trapeze is inoperative, the Parasite can be jettisoned. The pilot of the Parasite remains in the B-36 during the landings and takeoffs. These flight tests have demonstrated that the Parasite operation can be accomplished with a straight wing fighter under favorable conditions. Additional tests will include operation at night in turbulent air and with a swept-wing Parasite. Since the RF-84F is not available, Consolidated Vultee Aircraft, in conjunction with Republic Aviation Corporation, is currently modifying a swept-wing YF-84F to a Parasite configuration. Flights with this aircraft are scheduled for the fall of 1952 for the purpose of evaluating the low-speed characteristics of a swept-wing F-84 during Parasite operation. Flight tests of Project MX-1602 have indicated that the production B-36 RF-84F combination will provide the United States Air Force with a long-range reconnaissance capability utilizing the high-speed performance of the RF-84F to maximize survival over enemy territory.
This is the consolidated B-36 intercontinental bomber, sometimes referred to as the Peacemaker or the Big Stick. It was the largest conventional warplane ever built. It had tremendous range and a great payload. With its 6 piston engines turning, and later 4 more jets burning, the B-36 for many years projected America's military might.
It was a monstrous airplane. It had 6 engines, and they were pusher props. Now later on they hung jet pods on the ends of the wing, but the early models were all piston engines, pushers. It was a huge airplane, and it was designed then to carry atomic weapons.
But by the mid-50s, its sheer size, cruciform shape, and middling performance worked against it in a world of pure jets. However, in its heyday, the 36 was the very pinnacle of successful giantism. Rather surprising given that a decade and a half earlier, the United States had all but abandoned the idea of operating massive aircraft known as XBLRs, or the Experimental Bomber Long Range. The first attempt, the XBLR-1, resulted in the Boeing XB-15. This was an ambitious and useful experiment that demonstrated the importance of 4-engined bombers. The XB-15 carried a crew of 10. However, its 150-foot wingspan proved too large for practical use. But Boeing's next offering, the XB-17, which followed a year later, perfectly met the needs of the Army. Despite the Army Air Force's decision not to proceed with the XB-15, the political mood in 1938 was undergoing a sea change. With the acquisition of total power by the Nazi Party, American military planners had to contemplate a scenario of German domination of Europe, including Britain. In America in 1938, the question being secretly asked was what if Britain did fall? Perhaps the only way of striking back at the Axis powers in Europe was with the once dismissed experimental bomber long range. The XB-LR-2 came together as the XB-19, somewhat bigger than the XB-15, and in fact bigger than any other aircraft in the world at that time. It was to be built by Douglas Aircraft in California. However, by the time the B-19 first flew, the Battle of Britain had already been won, when a few hundred pilots of RAF Fighter Command were just able to halt the Nazi juggernaut. Notwithstanding these events, the B-19 project continued. Some indication of the project's size can be gained from the scope of its planning. The XB-19 required no less than 4 acres of drawings, 500 engineers, and more than 2 million hours of R&D and construction. The wings on their own had a 212-foot span and were over 1/10 of an acre in actual size. The wings also held 4 giant engines. Each one had more than twice the power of those on the B-15 predecessor. The B-19 even had its own hoists for changing the 16-foot propellers and was able to lift its own massive engines on and off the wings. Each wing contained a lighted passageway enabling crew to reach the engines in flight. The 2 massive main tires were 8 foot high, and each was of 24 ply, using 150 miles of rayon cord and 3 miles of steel wire. All of the flying control surfaces were so large that they could only be operated via power-assisted devices. The rudder alone took up an area of 237 square feet of movable surface. To communicate within such a large aircraft, it was necessary to install a 24-set telephone system and a loudspeaker cum fire alarm warning device. And to enable missions of up to 3 days and accommodate at least 13 crew, it was necessary to have a galley, a wardroom, as well as a bunk room. Such were the proportions of what Douglas liked to refer to as their hemispheric defender. In theory, this behemoth flying machine could fly more than 1/3 of the distance around the world without refueling, perhaps reaching parts of Europe and the return trip too. On June 27, 1941, the B-19 made its first flight from Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica to March Air Force Base. Despite various suggestions to the local press at the time, the B-19 was really a proof-of-concept aircraft to explore what could be learnt about building giant aircraft. The B-19 also presented the same problems and lengthy delays as Boeing had endured with its 4-year development of the B-15. Knowing that many of the lessons recently learnt were already becoming obsolete, Douglas suggested that the B-19 be abandoned. However, the Army remained firm that the XB-LR-2 would be delivered. In fact, the Douglas Company's view may have been quite sound, as the war had necessitated that the 2 prototype long-range bombers be ordered 6 months before the B-19 ever flew. The Northrop B-35 and its competitor, the enormous consolidated B-36, would use whatever data could be migrated from Douglas. In fact, the B-35's design was a totally different concept, relying upon advanced flying wing aerodynamics to gain maximum range, an idea that was far ahead of its time. Nevertheless, it was the consolidated XB-36 which the Air Force adopted. It was a symbol of pure 1940s giantism, and likely would have benefited from some of the ideas incorporated in the B-19. However, it was a virtual flying gas tank, carrying with it all the fuel it needed for a there-and-back European mission. The Second World War had come and gone before Consolidated's giant reached production, and as Britain did not fall to Germany, the 36's absence had no impact on the conflict, although its presence became critical in the Cold War that followed. It was during this potentially cataclysmic test that America's peacemaker really came of age. The newly formed Strategic Air Command under General Curtis LeMay would regularly fly to far distant territories just to demonstrate its enormous reach. It was all a very effective show of force, although by the mid-50s, one that was starting to be questioned.
The airplane flew like a glider. It was easy to fly. Anybody could have flown it with 5 hours of stick time. It was a beautiful airplane. It's good that they never had to fly military missions, even with the 4 jet engines which were placed on later.
The success of an earlier Strategic Air Command gamble with the B-47 Stratojet medium bomber demonstrated the need for a faster swept-wing, all-jet-power heavy bomber. Yet Consolidated felt they could still provide a ready answer. The B-60 arrived after a standard 36 fuselage was married to swept wings and tail surfaces. It was propelled by 8 turbojet engines. The concept would have been economical, but advances in in-flight refueling made it no longer necessary for massive fuel loads to be carried. The age of giantism was coming to an end. Strategic Air Command wanted a smaller, faster and more sophisticated heavy bomber, and Boeing's B-52 Stratofortress fitted the bill. And in terms of years of service for dollars spent, the B-52 was able to adapt and evolve in a way Convair's Big Stick never could. Still, credit where it's due. The B-36 was for a number of years America's sole intercontinental bomber and served as an effective deterrent, appropriately earning the type its other nickname, the Peacemaker.
During the early 1900s, as America began to emerge as a global power, Roosevelt delivered a prophetic statement on international diplomacy, advising to speak softly but wield a formidable presence. 50 years later, amid the United States' role as the foremost defender against communism, its formidable tool was undoubtedly the Convair B-36, a long-range bomber. Although this immense aircraft served predominantly throughout the 1950s, its origins can be traced back to before America's entry into the Second World War. The B-36 earned itself the unofficial title of Peacemaker. By 1941, the United States Army Air Force had 2 effective heavy bombers in its arsenal. One was the renowned B-17, crafted by the Boeing Company. This exceptional 4-engine aircraft played a crucial role throughout the war, with later heavily armed versions aptly dubbed the Flying Fortresses. A slightly later addition to the fleet was the consolidated B-24 Liberator. Featuring an advanced tricycle undercarriage allowing for swifter landings, the Liberator served in all theaters of the war. Moreover, its larger, sturdier fuselage facilitated conversion into transport planes, rendering the B-24 one of the most adaptable aircraft in the American infantry. The Liberator, like the 17, was also heavily defended, and it was also able to fly slightly higher than the Fortresses. However, more significantly, it boasted extended range, making it frequently utilized for maritime patrol missions, covering then what were considered significant distances solely on internal fuel. Both the B-17 and the B-24 could only complete the journey from America to Europe one way. In 1941, the Army Air Force had also commissioned another bomber, envisioned to surpass its predecessors in altitude and distance capabilities. Another creation by Boeing, the B-29 Superfortress stood out as the most formidable bomber deployed throughout the entire conflict. Despite several hundred being ordered, not a single prototype had taken to the skies. As a secondary contingency plan, in the case of any setbacks with the B-29, the consolidated B-32 Dominator was proposed. While this aircraft wasn't produced in large quantities, it did offer a reassuring alternative to the Superfortress's remarkable capabilities. However, by 1941, it too existed only on blueprints. By the middle of that year, Nazi Germany had conquered continental Europe, achieving successive victories. Of greater importance, despite Britain's partial air superiority, it endured relentless bombardment from the Luftwaffe, causing significant devastation to both its populace and industry. These raids, often conducted at night but sometimes during daylight, were perceived by the German High Command as means to subdue the island nation. The pressing question that American tacticians grappled with was simple. What would occur if the U.S. entered the conflict and the sole remaining Allied base in Europe fell to Germany? One option American strategists explored was the development of an aircraft with such extraordinary range that it could take off from bases on the American East Coast, cross the entire expanse of the Atlantic to deliver its payload, and then return to continental America without the need for refueling or fighter escort. The American aviation industry had previously created long-range bombers. Among these was an early Boeing endeavor, the XB-15. This aircraft boasted a wingspan of nearly 150 feet, requiring the full power of its four 1,000-horsepower engines to hoist its 35 tons of bulk into the air. The second experimental long-range bomber was developed by the Douglas Company, and the prototype XB-19 was ordered in September 1936. Upon completion, this aircraft boasted a wingspan of 212 feet, surpassing the XB-15 in size. The endeavor required 500 men, 9,000 drawings, 2 million man-hours, and $1.4 million of military funds, ultimately exceeding Douglas's original budget by an estimated $4 million. Undoubtedly, developing colossal aircraft proved to be a costly endeavor. Nevertheless, the XB-19 represented a significant milestone in aviation standards, not just in terms of size, but also in innovation. It was the inaugural aircraft to feature a retractable tricycle undercarriage and was designed to incorporate power-operated guns and a turret. If it had entered production, it would have boasted a range exceeding 7,000 miles. The insights gleaned from the XB-15 and XB-19 projects, coupled with the recognition of deficiencies in the aircraft inventory of the early 1940s and the looming prospect of waging a European war from the American shores, prompted the American Defense Department to address the challenge of producing an ultra-long-range heavy bomber capable of making a round trip across the Atlantic. To tackle this, it solicited designs from Northrop and Consolidated. The Northrop design was notably unconventional. The premise behind it was that eliminating the drag effect of the fuselage and tailplane could significantly enhance range. Thus, Northrop embarked on designing an aircraft essentially compromising only a wing, a flying wing. Consequently, on October 25, 1941, an order was placed for 2 XB-35 experimental bombers. The Consolidated design was more conventional than its competitor in shape, but certainly not in size. Featuring an expansive wing area of just under 5,000 square feet, the B-36 necessitated no fewer than 6 engines positioned at the rear of the wing to propel its colossal 163-foot fuselage through the air. On November 25, 1941, an order was sanctioned for 2 aircraft, with the expectation that the first would be developed by mid-1944 at a fixed fee of approximately $800,000 each. However, the much-needed bomber bases in Britain remained available to the Army Air Force, allowing the standard B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers to commence attacks on enemy targets from 1942 onward. Deployed in abundance, the fortresses and liberators exacted a devastating toll on the enemy. The demands of a Pacific theater, particularly after the seizure of the Mariana Islands in mid-1944, were capably met by Boeing's B-29, which provided the Air Force with the means to strike deep into Japan's heartland. Yet, it was a specific B-29 armed with a particular bomb that ultimately brought the Second World War to a close, marking the culmination of much military aircraft development. 2 notable exceptions to this narrative were the experimental long-range bombers, ordered only 2 weeks before American involvement in the conflict but never afforded sufficient priority until the war's conclusion, alongside the necessity to deploy a new weapon unforeseen in the wildest dreams of tacticians 4 years earlier. The inaugural Northrop B-35 was actually assembled in an open environment and finalized in June 1946. This clever design, which was the source of controversy for many years, was powered by 4 pusher engines and was intended to carry a crew of 9 in the pressurized center section, for its shape barely allowed the word fuselage to be applied. Despite its innovative design, which featured flaperons on the end of each wing instead of a conventional tailplane, the radical new shape of the flying wing was never able to completely overcome stability issues. Nevertheless, the flying wing stands as one of the most ingenious aviation concepts in history. The first XB-36 was rolled out of the experimental hangar just 6 days after Japan surrendered. However, it wasn't until August 1946, nearly 5 years after it was ordered, that the Peacemaker was ready for flight. The prototype's single main wheels were an impressive 100 inches in diameter, making them the largest ever produced for an aircraft. However, this feature would later prove to be a significant weakness. The 6 pusher-type engines were designed with air intakes located on the forward section of the wings. However, this advanced concept for its time also encountered initial difficulties in cooling the engines and would necessitate later modifications. On August 8, 1946, the first XB-36 commanded by a Captain Beryl A. Erickson, taxied down the Fort Worth runway with a total crew of 9 and 8,000 gallons of fuel. At precisely 10 minutes past 1 in the morning, Erickson lifted Convair's colossal aerial masterpiece into the air for the first time. It was the largest plane ever to take flight. The flight lasted no more than 37 minutes, during which the undercarriage remained in the wheels-down position as a safety precaution. Erickson's crew, on this occasion and many subsequent ones, subjected the giant aircraft to rigorous testing, swiftly identifying the challenges inherent in its immense size. One of the most significant challenges was the vibration generated by the immense engines spaced out across the wide expanse of the wing. Cooling, particularly at high altitudes, presented another issue. It was evident that the numerous areas would require substantial attention. However, perhaps the most fundamental challenge was the sheer size of the wheel arrangement, which restricted the Convair bomber to runways at least 22 inches thick. Given that only 3 such runways existed anywhere in America, it was clear that a solution needed to be found swiftly. The solution emerged in what was deemed another breakthrough, combining 4 56-inch wheels into a group under each wing. This arrangement spread the B-36's tremendous weight over a much broader area, allowing the Peacemaker to utilize runways of half the previously required thickness. Early in the B-36's development, Convair recognized the potential of leveraging its enormous wings and tailplane for the transport version of the Peacemaker's commercial counterpart, the XC-99, which conducted its maiden flight in November 1947. Still, larger again than its bomber counterpart, the 99 was assembled at Convair's San Diego operation, but with wings and other common parts shipped across the nation from Fort Worth. Here at Lindenberg Field, the aircraft that had now earned the title of the world's largest was now poised to showcase the potential that would later inspire the development of mammoth transport and airplane concepts in decades to come. The XC-99 garnered significant attention from Pan Am, which seriously contemplated a civilian version for the West Coast to Hawaii route. The airline even secured options on 3 such aircraft. However, the anticipated post-war airline boom failed to materialize for many years. The XC-99 never entered civilian service. The sole example produced remained in active duty with the Air Force until 1957, proving particularly invaluable during the Korean War, where it expedited essential payloads across the nation. Though this aircraft required modification with a new undercarriage system, once implemented, it proved remarkably versatile and had the capacity, if needed, to transport 400 fully equipped troops. However, it was ultimately ahead of its time. Despite the XC-99's intriguing potential, Convair's primary focus remained on the extra-long-range bomber concept. Throughout the late 1940s, Convair continued to refine and develop the B-36, underscoring its unparalleled ability to strike virtually any target worldwide and return to base in America. Long range would require many hours of physical endurance for the crew, and therefore inside the 36's massive fuselage, adequate provisions were made for sleeping quarters and a galley, complete with a 2-burner stove. Adequate provisions were always ensured for the crew aboard the B-36. However, the center pressurized section housing these amenities, was located a considerable 80 feet away from the forward control area, accessible only via a narrow tunnel spanning the distance. Heated food was packaged in specially designed containers for transport between the extensive distances of the two pressurized sections. Additionally, the tunnel served as the sole means for personnel to move between crew sections. Given the distances involved, a small trolley was provided to facilitate efficient movement for each member. The size of the B-36 also necessitated unique procedures not previously required by other aircraft. Immediately after takeoff, and before pressurization, a crew member was tasked with examining certain vulnerable areas within the massive interior structure forming the fuselage of the B-36. Only then would the plane be permitted to climb to higher altitudes and proceed with its mission. Numerous other challenges stemming from the sheer size of the B-36 also surfaced. There was a pressing question regarding how to service each of the massive aircraft, which was so large that special outdoor hangars had to be constructed to provide access to only the essential parts. Despite successful resolutions to the problem of engine vibration and cooling, there were undoubtedly serious concerns about the viability of the B-36 compared to other alternatives. Foremost among these was the upgraded competitor, the Flying Wing, which had transitioned to an all-jet aircraft by replacing its 4 propellers with 8 turbojet engines. Northrop aimed to enhance the speed and viability of its innovative concept, utilizing unique flaperons at the wing's end to compensate for the absence of a conventional tailplane. Another, more conventional competitor to the B-36 emerged from the past, the Boeing B-50. Essentially a standard superfortress from the Second World War era, the B-50 featured more powerful engines and extended range due to the underwing-mounted fuel tanks. This range was enhanced yet again by Boeing's successful development of aerial in-flight refueling. Thus, the Air Force had at its disposal a proven aircraft combination capable of flying the same range as the B-36, but without encountering the challenges of its immense size. By the late 1940s, due to these advancements, the future of the B-36 appeared increasingly bleak. Its salvation came through 2 significant developments. The first, poetically enough, was provided by Consolidated's long-term competitor. Boeing developed a successful medium-range bomber entirely powered by jets, leveraging captured German technology that demonstrated the advantages of a swept-back wing. The Boeing B-47 featured a wing not only swept but also remarkably flexible, capable of moving within an arc of 17 feet. To maintain a thin wing profile, the 6 engines had to be mounted in pods suspended from below. The outer pods each contained 1 engine, while the inboard pods each housed 2 engines suspended several feet below the wing's surface. Engineers from both companies collaborated to attach this equipment to the outmost wing of Boeing's aircraft. With 6 turning and 4 burning, the B-36 finally began to transition into the jet age. The other event, which was sure to secure the future of the 36, took place on June 24, 1948, when the Soviets closed the gate on Berlin, signaling in one step the beginning of the Cold War. The escalating concerns about communism culminated in an event that jolted the West out of its post-war complacency. NATO forces suddenly found themselves facing a formidable adversary, and the need for an intercontinental bomber swiftly transitioned from hypothetical to urgent reality. At this juncture, no aircraft in the world possessed the long-range capabilities of a Convair giant. Rather than canceling orders, demand for the Peacemaker actually increased. As apprehension persisted, the significance of America's Strategic Air Command, responsible for long-range bombing, grew substantially. It was ultimately placed under the direct command of General Curtis LeMay. LeMay boasted an impeccable record from World War II, beginning with his early involvement in European bombardment with the Army Air Force and continuing through his command of Pacific operations in the B-29 bombardment of Japan. Regarded as one of America's great wartime strategists, he also oversaw the Berlin airlift. Given his extensive experience, LeMay was deemed the most qualified individual to elevate the Strategic Air Command, including its rapidly expanding fleet of B-36s, to the highest level of readiness. Under LeMay's unwavering leadership of SAC, the American public found reassurance in the knowledge that although they no longer held a monopoly on atomic weaponry, they possessed arguably the most formidable platform for delivery, the B-36. Such was the military's concern for safeguarding its intercontinental bomber that security measures were heightened to a wartime level. Personnel in SAC-controlled rooms were required to carry firearms despite being hundreds of miles within American borders. The protection of America's formidable asset necessitated even mechanics servicing the engines to carry firearms while at work. Exercises were conducted at an increasingly intense pace, around the clock and in all-weather conditions under LeMay's leadership.
Out, this is engineer. Engineer's checklist complete. Ready for takeoff. Over.
Pilot checklist complete. Ready for takeoff.
Roger, give me 100% on the jet.
Roger. Jet's coming up.
Engineer, give me full power. Full power coming on.
Jet's 100%. Tailpod temp okay.
Takeoff power is set. Everything's stabilized. Engineer ready for takeoff. Roger. Carswell Tower, Air Force 653, ready for takeoff. Air Force 653, Carswell Tower, roger, clear to roll. Roger, 653, rolling. Here we go. Give me climb power. Roger. Climb power coming on. Give me 96% on the jets. Roger, 96% on the jets.
Often flying individually rather than in formation, SAC's peacemakers practice bombing raids over vast distances with minimal notice. The B-36s utilized the K-1 bombing navigation system for precision accuracy. This sophisticated system comprised 365 vacuum tubes, enabling the B-36 to conduct bombing runs at high speeds regardless of weather conditions. Targets typically consisted of radio signals emitted from special trucks designed to assess the accuracy of SAC's aircraft. Despite the hefty price tag of over $5 million per aircraft, coupled with the K-1 system and LeMay's insistence on relentless training, the combination ensured nothing short of exceptional accuracy.
Pilot, this is radar. We're over the IP. Pick up a heading of 197.
Bob Flight Air Force 653, over the IP. Up to 35,000 on an inbound heading of 197 degrees. Flight Air Force 653, 30 seconds to go. The bomb's away. 15 seconds to go, bomb flight. Zone switch coming on. Bombs away.
Despite the remarkable potential of the Convair giant, critics often raised concerns about its large size, which could potentially make it a prime target for enemy fighters. Even before the first B-36 took flight, the Air Force ordered a unique auxiliary, the McDonnell Goblin, intended as a Parasite fighter to be carried within the B-36. This extraordinary design was stripped down to the bare essentials and featured fold-down wings that allowed the aircraft to be fully concealed within the B-36's bomb bay. While it was never actually deployed with the Peacemaker, its flight controls were operated from a B-29 mothership, and flight trials began in 1948. In August, with test pilot Ed Scorch secured in the cockpit, the Goblin was launched by a trapeze mechanism from the B-29, and the pilot successfully flew what must be considered one of America's most remarkable fighters. However, upon attempting to reconnect the Goblin's hook to the trapeze, turbulence caused the little fighter to lift, and the mother's plane mechanism broke the canopy, wrenching the oxygen mask away from the pilot. But Scorch was just able to regain control and crash land this tiny fighter. This setback did not stop development. The second and only other Goblin produced continued its assigned task. Eventually, on October 14, 1948, a successful hookup was achieved, and the Goblin was pulled up into the B-29's belly. However, despite the bold concept, the bomber-fighter Parasite combination was never adopted, as it seemed to pose as many problems as it attempted to solve. Nevertheless, a later Parasite project involving the B-36 was the Phycon concept. This program commenced in 1952 and entailed mating a Republic F-84 directly underneath a modified Peacemaker. Unlike the previous concept, there was no intention of fully enclosing the F-84 within the mothercraft. Only after both aircraft were airborne would the fighter pilot enter the cockpit. Together, with the highly trained boom operator positioned in the mother plane, they would undertake the delicate task of lowering the fighter using a large hydraulically operated boom to a point below the bomber where the fighter could be safely released. This operation proved remarkably successful, and although the recoupling process demanded great skill, it was eventually perfected to a fine art. The combination of these aircraft provided many potentials, especially as the pilot was able to come and go from the fighter when it was in the docked position. In reality, the Phycon mission was primarily intended to enhance the reconnaissance capabilities of the B-36. The F-84, whether in its straight or swept-wing configuration, was an incredibly versatile aircraft. While SAC utilized it as its own fighter aircraft, there's no denying its potential as an effective fighter bomber, as demonstrated during the Korean War. Given SAC's ability to transport such versatile aircraft thousands of miles to the very edge of enemy territory, coupled with the simultaneous development of small, compact nuclear weapons, it's conceivable that SAC could have employed its Phycon combination in a bomber role. By the mid-1950s, the B-36 was fully developed and deployed at various SAC bases across the nation. By the early 1950s, SAC's Peacemakers had reached the pinnacle of their development, with early engine and vibration issues resolved. With the support of jet power and modifications such as the new quick-action bomb bay door, the B-36 personified the ultimate intercontinental atomic bomber of the era. Despite the technical success of the project, it continued to face political and inter-service criticism. As early as 1949, there was an investigation into the political influences surrounding the B-36 that would ultimately yielded no significant outcomes. However, the Navy's resentment toward the Peacemaker was more pronounced and perhaps more justified. The cancellation of its promised 65,000-ton supercarrier, which was intended to deliver atomic attacks on potential Soviet industrial centers, was partly attributed to the Air Force's insistence that the B-36 represented a more flexible deterrent strategy rather than the eggs-in-one-basket philosophy of a carrier. Equally significant was the SAC's assertion that it could operate just as effectively from the edge of enemy territory under conditions that would be unattainable for naval aviation. To demonstrate this, B-36s would periodically fly from their central USA bases to the very edge of Soviet territory. Highly trained crews comprising pilots, navigators, radio operators, engineers, and gunners would endure for long hours of flight, often at very high altitudes over thousands of miles to the frozen wastelands of Alaska. These men understood that once in the Arctic region, should their aircraft fail and crash land, as some did, there would be minimal chance of survival in the sub-zero and uninhabited wilderness. Against these prospects, the roar of the Peacemaker's 6-piston and 4-jet engines must have sounded far more a blessing than a curse. The Navy's criticism of the Peacemakers persisted, reaching a point where they formally requested the Air Force to allow them to test its defensive capabilities against Navy fighters. Outwardly, the B-36 appeared to have minimal defensive armament. However, hidden beneath sliding panels, it concealed 6 remotely controlled turrets, each equipped with 2 20mm cannons. These turrets could be raised hydraulically as needed. When used in conjunction with the forward nose turret and radar-controlled rear turret, the B-36 boasted a total of 16 cannons, covering every approach within a range of over half a mile. This made the Peacemaker the most heavily defended aircraft in aviation history. Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska was a point to which many B-36s on exercise would travel. Here, Peacemaker captains would land their massive aircraft, uncertain of the prevailing weather conditions as they made their approach. For some, the landing functioned much the same as their departure point thousands of miles away. However, for others following closely behind, visibility could be near zero, pushing the pilot's skill and determination to the limit. Even in this environment, where weather conditions offered as much protection for grounded aircraft as they posed risks for those in the air, anti-aircraft protection remained abundant. Under this protection, ground crew would immediately begin servicing the landed aircraft. For these men, the journey from aircraft to heated bus was not a short one, and they had to adapt the hostile environment as best they could. With efficiency, the aircraft would be refueled by crews working on the icy wing surfaces, mindful of the potentially fatal consequences of a fall. With padded clothes and gloved hands, these ground crews took perhaps a difference, but nonetheless, a real risk as those who flew. With time always passing, each engine would be assigned its own crew member to conduct necessary checks before inclement weather set in. The extreme cold of the region meant that if aircraft had been idle for more than a brief period, the engines would require additional heating, primarily through the large air intakes to prevent them from freezing solid. To address this, large mobile heating units were developed, capable of delivering significant amounts of hot air into and around all the piston engines. The crew compartment also received similar treatment, not only to ensure habitability, but also because instrumentation and onboard equipment would not function effectively in such frigid conditions. Refueled and ready for departure, the B-36s would once again brave the cold Arctic sky on their journey southward, leaving the area to its natural inhabitants. However, the primary purpose of these exercises was to demonstrate that from Alaskan bases, it would be just as feasible to turn northwest towards Soviet territory and deliver the devastating cargo for which the B-36 was developed. Another type of cargo was also identified. Convair, which designed the 36, won the contract for the Air Force's first supersonic bomber, the B-58 Hustler, which was the culmination of Convair's long involvement with the Delta design. Moving an as-yet unflown bomber from base to base proved to be challenging of a task, until a temporary solution was found, mounting it under a standard B-36 with its two inboard props removed, protecting the wingtips of the newcomer. This image perhaps symbolizes, above all else, the contrast between two generations of aircraft. In less than a decade, the pursuit of a faster bomber aircraft had radically altered their shape and size, to the extent that tomorrow's medium bomber could fit snugly beneath yesterday's heavy bomber. Clearly, the era of giantism was drawing to a close, yet Convair still harbored hopes for its mammoth aircraft in an upgraded form. In response to the Air Force's requirement for an all-jet heavy bomber, the company developed the YB-60. Hopes were high at Fort Worth in April 1952 when the YB-60 made its first public debut. Continuation of the production line would secure the jobs of thousands of staff and subcontractors, bringing added prosperity to the city that had produced the world's largest bomber. The YB-60 was virtually a B-36, with fully new swept wings and a tailplane. With no defensive armament other than the rear turret, the entire rear crew and quarters were omitted from the YB-60. Enhanced power and reduced weight propelled the YB-60 to a top speed of just over 500 miles per hour. Its production was achieved rapidly, as 70% of its components were standard to the B-36. The Air Force ordered 2 such examples to test the concept, but only actually flew one. On August 14, 1954, at a ceremony at Convair's production line in Fort Worth, the last B-36 was handed over to the Air Force. The final delivery from the Peacemaker plant must have been a bittersweet moment for the people of Fort Worth, although Convair would continue to utilize the plant for many successful projects. It was from this base that they had produced, for many years, the largest plane ever to fly, a plane that many would argue, due to its sheer size, helped win a war without having to engage in combat.